Welcome into the Jazz Notes podcast. I'm Ben Anderson.
I'm Chandler Holt.
It is August 20th. We are in the dead season of the NBA. I've said that 3 weeks in a row, and the Jazz keep having news come out, so expect something big in the next week. No, I'm not at all. I do think the Jazz have actually slowed down a little bit, but there was a lot that happened over the last week, as we're joking about. You can find us on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. Find Chandler at C. Holt Sports. You can read us at KSLSports.com. Find us on all social medias at KSL Sports. All right, we are going to talk about the Jazz's most recent signing. A little bit surprising. We actually had a listener who tweeted at us and asked about this specific name. So credit to you. I don't remember who it was, but credit to you, and thank you for listening. I should have done that research before. The Jazz schedule released. The full availability of the podcast or the noteworthy documentary is out as well. I guess we could touch on that a little bit, but we probably don't need to. And then we'll get to your mailbag questions as always. Anything else I missed?
I don't think so. I think we're ready to get into it.
All right, let's start with Patty Mills. The Jazz sign Patty Mills, fresh off of a pretty good performance actually in the Australian for the Australian national team at the Paris Olympics. 1 year, $3.3 million deal, and the Jazz have 15 roster spots. That's all you can carry, and that's what they have.
Yes, they have their finalized roster. You have Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson, Keontae George, Sensabaugh, Svi Mikhailuk, Isaiah Collier, Patty Mills, Markkanen, Hendricks, Cody Williams, Johnny Juzang, Filipowski, John Collins, Walker Kessler, and Drew Eubanks. Do you think Patty Mills is going to play a lot? What do you think his role is going to be with the team?
I don't think so, which is why when we were asked about it in a mailbag maybe a month ago, 3 weeks ago, I said I don't think Patty Mills makes sense because he's kind of in the Joe Ingles era of his career. He's not really a guy who can get a lot of minutes. But again, he looked good for the Australian national team, for the Boomers, and he knows Will Hardy. They worked together, obviously, in San Antonio when Will was an assistant coach, so I'm sure he's happy to have Patty come in. I don't think Patty was looking to play 82 games and was maximizing a spot. I do think Patty Mills, and I really do believe this is a theory I have, but I'm going to ask some Jazz people about it when I see them again, which won't be for a little bit. I really wonder if there's a belief that you can't develop your young players if you don't have real spacing around them. Like if you just have a bunch of non-shooters and the defense is just hanging out in the paint, with all due respect to Chris Dunn, how do we know what Cody Williams can do?
Yeah.
How do we know what Bryce Sensabaugh can do? How do we know what Keontae George can do or Taylor Hendricks when, one of the problems I thought last year for Keontae George was that the Jazz just said, Will Hardy said it a bunch of times, we need Keontae George to take off the dribble threes above the break, which is a really hard shot to make, and it's going to kill his averages. But the NBA requires that type of spacing, and he and Jordan Clarkson are the only two players on the roster who can consistently get that shot off, not even make it, because they didn't make it, but just get that shot off. So the threat that you have to do it means either whatever they're doing on the pick and roll, if they're hedging, if they're trapping, if they're dropping, you have to respect it, and you have to defend it differently, and that will create other looks for Lowry. That'll create other looks for John Collins. So maybe by adding Svi Mikhailuk, who's a shooter, and adding Patty Mills, who's a shooter, and having veterans who do that and just space the floor a little bit allows the system to run the way it's supposed to, and then you can actually get a better judgment on what these players are.
Last year, a lot of teams played more or less 80s and 90s defense against the Jazz. I'm talking about like a step or two away from the key for 3 or 4 defenders.
Yep.
Right? And then, of course, when Markkanen is in, they'll switch it up a little bit. But when you're, like you talk about, when you run a lineup out there with Dunn, Sexton, Clarkson on an off night, and then John Collins
or Walker.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Defense is just, it wasn't really a threat. But now you add these guys who are at least a threat. You need to put a hand up on them. Maybe they're not elite shooters, but they're still a threat. And then it'll give these guys the space, because you don't want Cody Williams and Taylor Hendricks to have to break down their defender. You want them to get their looks within the offense.
Easy. You want them to get easy shots and get confidence, because really the best way to make the NBA right now is hit threes and then play a little bit of defense.
Yep.
And if Cody Williams and Taylor Hendricks can do that, and we'll talk about Taylor in the mailbag coming up here, that's a real benefit for them. It's also why I think Kyle Filipowski has a real chance to play, because if he can shoot the three at all, which he was a bit of a mixed bag at Duke and in Summer League, but if he can make some shots and space the floor as a legit 5, maybe you could actually play him with John Collins, because then Flip could essentially play the 4 or play the 5 and John plays the 4. I think there's a real pathway to him getting on the floor over a guy like Drew Eubanks. Or, maybe they try and get Drew Eubanks to shoot threes this year, which he's never really done a whole lot of. So Yeah, I believe that. And then if Patty Mills is hitting a bunch of threes and looks good in the first half of the season, you trade him at the trade deadline. Miami even picked him up last year after Atlanta waived him. Like, Patty Mills is the type of guy that has championship experience, has been around, it's not going to be a headache, knows exactly what the coach is going to ask of him. He's going to be in the right spot every trip down the floor, and that has value.
And speaking of the coach, he has a connect to Will Hardy from his days back in San Antonio. Like you said, he's definitely not in the prime of his career anymore. Last year, 32 games played, basically averaged 4-1-1, and his shooting splits were down, but still...
Like, way down.
Yeah, way down. But still brings a veteran presence and has that basketball IQ, and I think the Jazz need that.
Yep, and won't be, like, relied on as much as we're saying, like, to help space the floor. Like, Miami was a bad three-point shooting team towards the end of the year, so they needed him to shoot threes, and he shot, like, 28%.
Yeah.
The Jazz are just like, well, if you're open, shoot. And if you're not open, don't worry about it.
Yep.
Or don't play. Then it doesn't matter if he plays or not. But, yeah, they filled out the roster. I guess I was a little surprised that they did that, though it is worth noting, and I can check the transaction log right now, I don't think he's signed.
Okay.
So the Jazz are maintaining flexibility there, just on the off chance that something else presents itself. Not that they wouldn't sign him, but having an open roster spot gives you some flexibility, and then you sign Patty the last day before the season. Yeah, they have not. They've not officially signed him. So that's a little bit telling, too, that they're still keeping their eye on the market and flexibility and have some different options on different ways that they can sign Patty Mills with all these weird exceptions and veteran exceptions and cap space and non-cap space and room space, whatever it's called. So they've got some options there. Otherwise, the big piece of news that came out was that the schedule was released for the Jazz, and that is not insignificant. And I have some takeaways. I'll let you start. Do you have anything that jumped out to you immediately?
I have some stats about the Jazz schedule, but first we can just talk about how the season sort of opens for the Jazz. Home opener and season opener.
Brutally is how it opens.
Yes. Starting out against the rejuvenated Memphis Grizzlies. This is not the Grizzlies from last year. They're going to have all their players back. Another home game against Golden State. First road game against Dallas, but then 4 of the first 5 games are at home, next 2 against Sacramento and San Antonio. Then the next 5 gets really rough. Denver, Chicago on the road, Milwaukee, San Antonio, and Phoenix. That 10th game of the season, that's when the NBA Cup starts.
I wrote an article last week, you can still go find it at kslsports.com, about the 3 dates within the regular season that we're going to know more about the Jazz. And the first one was literally day 2. So the season, or I guess it's day 3 of the NBA season, day 2 for the Jazz. When do they open? What's their first game?
Against Memphis, I believe it's on the 23rd.
23rd.
Yes.
By the 24th, we will know what the Jazz are doing. If Cody Williams starts and Kyle Filipowski plays and Bryce Sensabaugh plays and we don't see Patty Mills, we don't see Drew Eubanks, we don't see some of these veterans, the Jazz are very clearly just saying, like, we're rolling out the young guys and Cooper Flagg is going to be a part of the team, hopefully, in the future, and that's what we're doing. If Patty Mills is playing, if Drew Eubanks is playing, if Svi Mykhailiuk is starting, it's probably a little bit more similar to what we've seen each of the last 2 years. Well, you'll play some veterans, and you'll just try and establish a culture, and then you'll trade whoever you can off at the trade deadline and fall apart the second half of the season. So we will know about that. And then I think I put like December 6th. Mm-hmm. And December 6th is after this 21-game stretch to start the season, which is a little more than a quarter of the season. The Jazz have 1 game against a truly awful team, and it's Chicago.
Okay.
Now, it's on the road, and to be fair, they lost to Chicago last year on the road. Chicago shouldn't be as good. They lost to DeMar DeRozan. But 17 of those 21 teams are legitimately, like, probably expected to make the playoffs. And the other, I think 3 or 4 of the other ones, outside of Chicago, 4 of the other are against Victor Wembanyama and the Spurs, who also have Chris Paul now and, had a high draft pick. And it's just like, they might legitimately be great.
Yeah.
Not great. I don't want to say that they're not competing for a title, but very clearly play-in contenders this year. Could be that 9th seed, 10th seed. And then it's like, is Golden State bad randomly? Probably not, but you're probably losing to Golden State. There's a chance the Jazz have 5 wins through 21 games. I mean, they only had 7 last year, and then they turned it around in mid-December. So I don't want to say it's not possible to turn it around, but the problem for the Jazz this year is if you're December, I think 6th is the date, and you're at 5 wins, you go on the road all of December.
Yep.
Between December 6th and the 26th, they're not home. They will have 1 home game during the NBA Cup, assuming that they don't make the NBA Cup, and they come back and they get 1 random game added to their schedule. There'll be 1 road game, 1 home game. But, man, you're talking about a different city for 8 straight games throughout December. If you've got 5 wins, you might have 5 wins on Christmas.
Yeah.
And it's an exaggeration. They're probably at 8 or 9, but if you've got 9 wins going into January, you're in real trouble. Real trouble. And that's probably where the Jazz at least Jazz fans want them to be in trouble with their record, so you just focus on playing the young guys, and I think it's entirely possible.
So I have some stats about the Jazz schedule for the 80 games that have been released up to this point. They have the 7th easiest strength of schedule.
Okay.
Just talking about opponents. Everyone is between, I don't know exactly how the statistic works, but everyone is between basically like 0.49 and 0.53.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Based on what their last year's performance was.
Yep.
Because it's a zero-sum game. Every team wins a game, every team loses a game, and every game, there's not a huge, and you play every team, there's not a huge gap in who you do and don't play.
They have 15 back-to-backs. They traveled the 6th most miles in the NBA, over 45,000 miles throughout the season. They have 9 rest advantages, which means that they will have more rest, coming off more rest days than their opponent when they play them, and they have 12 rest disadvantages, the opposite.
Okay.
So
the last time the Jazz had this brutal of a schedule, I should note, was 2 years ago when they opened, and I thought, the Jazz fell on a sword to get Victor Wembanyama, and they started out 12-3 or whatever it was. Yep. So it's possible they far outperform expectations, but this is really a tough schedule.
Yes.
And even like the teams that didn't make the playoffs that they play, as we mentioned, are the Memphis Grizzlies, who are going to be way better this year, and the Sacramento Kings, who were buyers in the offseason, adding DeMar DeRozan, and are going to be tough. So I think the Jazz are set up for a pretty difficult start to the year. Now, that also means that your schedule eases up. The hard part is, does it ease up before the trade deadline, and then you get some opportunities to win games, or does it just, by that point you're bad enough and you've leaned into all your young players that it doesn't really matter? And in February, after the 6th, when they have the trade deadline, which, by the way, was the third date I put it the most important date, the Jazz go at Phoenix, at Clippers, 2 days off, at the Lakers, home against the Lakers. They go into the All-Star break, and then they come back with this crazy home stretch. OKC, Houston, Portland, Sacramento, Minnesota, Pelicans, Pistons. That could be potentially important as well. Looking at last year's schedule, how did the Jazz get to 31 wins? A lot of that was beating up on the bad teams.
Yes.
They beat the Detroit Pistons twice. They beat the Memphis Grizzlies, who were bad last year, again, twice. They beat the Portland Trailblazers 3 times. They beat the Raptors twice. They beat the Wizards twice. Well, the Wizards, the Raptors, the Trailblazers, that's 7 wins the Jazz had last year. Those are the teams that are competing with the Jazz for the worst in the records in the NBA. If you want to drop below 31, get down to 26, 25 wins, which I think is certainly possible, you got to lose some of those games.
Do you know if most of those wins came before the trade deadline, or maybe in that December stretch?
Well, yeah, because I think they won 2 games. Yeah. They were so bad last year at the end of the season that they did, they randomly beat the Clippers, so they had 2 wins against the Clippers last year. That's probably more than you want.
Yep.
They did sweep the Milwaukee Bucks last year. Somehow. You certainly don't expect that, but they went on the road and beat them 127-121. You don't expect that to happen. No, excuse me. It was on the road. It was 132-116. They mopped the floor with Milwaukee in that game. So some of those are the games that you've got to expect, like, are they actually going to win this game? They beat OKC in late February as the day before the trade deadline.
Wow. I
think so. That's what you got to keep an eye on.
Yes.
Those are the games you're certainly circling. Do you lose both of those games? Otherwise, I'm just looking at their losses. It was like, well, yeah, you lost 3 games to the Mavericks. They were in the finals. You lost 3 games to the Nuggets. They were a good team. You lost 4 games to the Warriors. You lost 4 games to the Timberwolves. You lost 3 games to the Thunder. You lost 4 games to the Suns. Those are the games you should lose. And in fact, you probably want them to lose all of those. And then if you're hoping for Cooper Flag or these good players next year, more of those bad teams being some losses as well. So Portland, Washington, Toronto, Charlotte, all games to circle as far as if the Jazz are 500 against those teams. They were well above 500 last year. They're probably down in those low 20s, mid-20s. If they sweep those teams like they did a lot of them last year, they're up at 30 again, and that's probably a bad spot to be.
Like you said, we will see the Jazz's plan after that first game, but something that bodes well for them, if it is true, like 100% tank, like we're talking Pistons last year type style for the season. And we'll do this leading up to the season. Last year, we talked about Western Conference teams, where we think the Jazz will lie and what we think their record will be. We talked about this in a previous episode. I think Portland is the only Western Conference team that we think will be worse than the Jazz will be. And even then,
I'm not convinced of it.
Yeah, I'm not convinced of it. So that bodes well. But with that said, you do need to lose some of those games to bad teams in the East in those home and away matchups.
Yeah, you can't beat Toronto on the road. You can't beat Washington on the road. You can't beat Charlotte on the road. If you want to be bad, you got to be bad. Yep. You can't sweep the Pistons this year. You got to be bad. And again, I think the Pistons are probably a little bit better than people are giving them credit for. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll jump into the mailbag. Stick around. More Jazz Notes coming up next. Welcome back to the Jazz Notes podcast. Ben Anderson, Chandler Holt, every Tuesday at Ben's Hoops. I send this tweet out at about 11 o'clock asking for your Jazz questions for the mailbag. You can respond right to that reply. If you do want to reach out early, you don't see that tweet, you can always DM me on either Instagram or Twitter. I have to admit, I sometimes forget. So sometimes you DM me, I'm like, oh, that'll be a good question. And then Tuesday rolls around and my brain is doing something else and I miss it. So I apologize. I know that has happened a couple of times, but if you don't see me on Tuesday, you can always try and send that early, and I will promise you I will try to remember. All right, Chandler, what are our questions?
First up, from the Great Bambus, do you think there is any chance of Taylor Hendricks or Bryce Sensabaugh playing in the G League again this season, or have they 100% graduated?
I fully expect Bryce to play in the G League this year. I fully expect him to, and I wouldn't rule out Taylor. If Taylor comes out and is shooting 13% through the first 5 games of the season, and the Jazz are like, all right, ease off the gas a little bit. We threw too much at you because, again, we just talked about how brutal this schedule is to start. We don't want to ruin your confidence. Go and dominate in the G League a little bit, or go just get your rhythm in the G League a little bit. Mm-hmm. Year 2 is hard. Look at how badly Walker Kessler played last year when a little adversity was thrown his way. Let's see if we can get your confidence back up. But I fully expect Bryce to play in the G League.
Yep.
I could be way off, but you got to play minutes. I mean, again, there's only 240 minutes a night, and the Jazz are going to play guys. And I do think, if we go back to my original point where we opened the podcast, which is I think running an NBA system is actually good for players to develop within. If you are prioritizing Cody Williams over Bryce Sensabaugh, which you should do, or you're prioritizing Taylor Hendricks over minutes for Bryce Sensabaugh. I know they play a different position, but just getting those guys on the floor and finding lineups around them, you should probably play Svi Mykhailiuk.
Yeah.
You should probably play Patty Mills to give them some idea of how the NBA works, how spacing works, and make your life easier, versus just Bryce Sensabaugh, Cody Williams, Taylor Hendricks, Kyle Filipowski, Isaiah Collier being a 5-man rotation for the Jazz. You could have all 5 of those guys on the floor if you wanted to. I don't know if you're going to learn anything.
Yeah.
They're just going to get absolutely demolished. It's going to look ugly, and it's not going to help them. So I expect Bryce to play in the G League.
I agree with you. I think Bryce 100%, and also for Taylor, of course, if he plays bad, I think, of course, they'll send him down at least for a few games. But even when there's breaks in the Jazz schedule, whether it be NBA Cup, All-Star Weekend, I don't know exactly how the G League lines up, but I'm sure they'll throw him down for a game or two, regardless.
Yeah, if there's a back-to-back, and the Jazz are just saying, hey, Taylor, we're going on the road for this back-to-back, and you're only getting 5 minutes right now because you're struggling, go play 30 minutes, 2 nights with the Stars, and come back up. So I bet they both play. I would say Bryce is probably 100%. Yep. Taylor's probably 70%. So, yeah, but good question. Thank you.
Next up from Jazz Time Jones, do Jazz have a full roster, or is there an open spot to take on bar salaries?
So, again, I think it's bad salaries. I'm guessing that was a misspelling, but it does say bar. You're right. We read whatever's in front of us. As we talked about, they have not technically signed Patty Mills, which they're keeping an eye on this availability. They are keeping this open. Now, sometimes there are guys who are on vacation and they can't get things done and they can't take their physicals or whatever, but I think the Jazz are keeping that for flexibility, but they do have 15 roster spots.
Yep.
So, maybe you could do a certain trade where you could get rid of one guy and take 2 back or something, and then you still have that extra spot, and you could sign Patty Mills after the fact, but no, basically this is probably what the roster looks like. In fact, the Jazz would probably have to go 2 guys out to get 1 guy back in certain situations. Or you do a trade where you send Walker Kessler to the Pelicans for a first-round pick and you say, well, okay, now a roster spot just opens up and the Pelicans need a center. Something like that. You could still work on those types of things and keep some financial flexibility. But this is basically what the roster is going to look like. And I was a little surprised they finalized it this quickly. But clearly they saw a guy who they thought could help the roster in multiple ways. And that's what Patty Mills does.
Next question here from Alex. I've noticed a lot of media folks trying to temper expectations around Taylor Hendricks after spending last year hyping him up. What would be a successful year for him this year? And which of the young guys do you think will be key contributors in 24 months? I think that for players that are defensive-minded, it's smart to temper your expectations with them because a lot of NBA fans are looking for highlights. They're looking for big numbers. When Taylor Hendricks could average 8, 5, and 4 and have a spectacular season with the Jonathan Isaac effect. He could play great team defense, great individual defense. And that especially shows with, let me use an example like Derek White. Derek White was great even for the Spurs a few years ago, but he really started showing his worth this year with the Celtics, showing how much he can add to a team defense and just to a winning culture. So I think that tempering expectations may come just from his play style. In terms of what would be a successful year for him, just getting better. It's his second year. You know, you don't need to put up crazy stats.
Yeah, I would say fewer mistakes.
Yeah.
He averaged 7 points, 4.5 rebounds, and actually shot the heck out of the ball. 45% from the floor, 38% from three. Like the 38% from three is the number that really matters there. Yep. But it's nice that he wasn't at 40% because he's a forward. And at this point, I think he's more of a 4-5 than he is a 3-4. Now that doesn't mean that's where he's going to finish his career. And the Jazz were trying to figure out, is he Trevor Ariza or is he Jeremy Grant? Like where is he in that framework of your offense and your lineup? I still think he's trending bigger just because his ball skills are not terrific right now, and he still struggled with them, I thought, at Summer League quite a bit. One of the things I would really look for from Taylor Hendricks is a sense of belonging. Mm-hmm. I still think there are times when he doubts whether or not he's as good as he is. And it's because he was under-recruited or wasn't that good as a senior in high school and then jumped onto the scene at Central Florida, and all of a sudden he was this really highly touted prospect. He still seems to have imposter syndrome sometimes, and we saw that, I thought, early in the Summer League. And then he had that game in Vegas where he was, 8 of 9 from the floor, whatever it was, 10 of 11, had over 20 points, 10 rebounds, knocked down threes, just played super confident, took the easy reads. Just like, oh, you're leaving me open, I'll shoot, and you closed out too hard, I'll dribble past you and dunk. So I want to see some of that confidence of just like, I know exactly what my job is. Sometimes he still is like, can I break down Kevin Durant off the dribble? It's like, don't do that. You don't need to do that. No, nobody's asking you to do that. So I think that's what I would look at for a successful season from Taylor Hendricks, is just like playing easy and confident, because the skills, I have no doubt, are there. And then play hard. It was really noticeable when he was like engaged and playing hard and had some huge games with a bunch of offensive rebounds. And then there were some games where you could tell he was like a little scared or whatever it was, and intimidated, which I get is very common for a 20-year-old. I would hope that will jump up. I hope that improves. That would be a good season for Taylor Hendricks. And
then follow-up question from him. Which of the young guys do you think will be key contributors in 24 months?
Key. Flip. I think I'm way higher on Kyle Filipowski than most people are.
Okay.
At least in my sense. Like, we had David Locke on my radio show, and he didn't think Filipowski would be in the rotation at all. He thought Collier would be in over him. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's right. I think Collier plays a much more difficult position.
Yes.
And doesn't do anything unique that the Jazz don't already have a lot of guys who do. Like, Collier gets downhill and gets to the rim. Well, Colin Sexton does it, but he does it so much better. Yeah. And Keontae probably does it a lot better too. And then Patty Mills can do the other stuff as a third-string point guard. So I could see Collier getting a lot of time in the G League. Locke disagrees, and we'll see. Maybe Locke's heard something I haven't. But like, Filipowski does things the Jazz don't have. Mm-hmm. A big guy who passes that well. I mean, he passes. No one else on the Jazz passes that well. So that's a real plus for him. But I think, so Filipowski, Hendricks, he's going to play a lot over the next 24 months. Keontae George, obviously. I mean, that's 3 young guys, to be honest. Oh, and Cody Williams. So that would be the 4. And you've got 6 first or second year players. If you want to say Walker Kessler's a young guy as well, I would think he contributes a lot, but, do backup centers contribute a lot? And I still expect him to be the backup center behind John Collins to start the year. Your thoughts?
I think in 24 months, I think Keontae, I'm still really high on Keontae, even though he had his stretches of bad play last year. And then in terms of this draft class, I think it is Cody Williams and Filipowski for me as well. For me, I just see so much of Isaiah Collier I see so much of Colin Sexton in Isaiah Collier, and it's just, he's, like you said, a better version of that right now. So just let him learn from him, maybe give him spot minutes, garbage time minutes, and G League minutes.
I think the problem with Collier is his biggest weakness is something that you can't do, which is turn the ball over.
Yes.
If you turn the ball over, just like bringing it up the court, well, Keontae already does that. And I mean that with all due respect. Like, you can give one guy an allowance to do that. You can give one guy an allowance to, like, make mistakes trying to run the offense and learn it. You can't have 2 guys just spraying the ball all over the floor and never getting into anything. Again, it goes back to, like, that's why you have to have Svi Mykhailiuk and Patty Mills and Drew Eubanks play. It's just like, have some semblance of what it actually looks like so you can get to your third pass in your offense. If you can't get to your second pass in your offense because Keontae or Collier are turning the ball over, it's bad, and Keontae's a better prospect than Isaiah Collier was.
Yeah.
Now, not a higher recruit, but a better NBA prospect, which is why Keontae was drafted just outside the lottery, and Collier fell to the second to last pick of the first round. Mm-hmm. He was not all that highly beloved coming out. And then he showed some of those awards, I thought, once he got to Vegas. He was good in Salt Lake and then bad in Vegas. So he'll get there, his opportunity in the preseason, but if he can't fix those issues, which were issues at USC and followed him at least to Vegas, I don't expect him to play a whole lot. And that doesn't mean he can't be in 24 months, but early on,
Yes.
I'm not betting on him.
And also just talking about 24 months, I think that like with Keontae and then like you're one of the bigger advocates for this, that Colin Sexton could like stay with the Jazz. Like he's a borderline all-star player. How does he eventually fit in with the Jazz? Like, is it a backup point guard or is it a third string point guard? Like that remains to be seen. For Collier.
For Collier. Oh yeah, right. Yeah, Collier probably a backup point guard his whole career.
Yeah.
It's tough, but that's probably realistic.
Last question here from Kenyon John. What's the best path that leads us to #capture the flag?
Playing Isaiah Collier. No. Yeah, playing the young guys.
Yeah.
It is. It's matching all your veteran lineups with young players, and like at least 2 on the floor at all times.
Mm-hmm.
You do that, you're fine. You're going to lose a lot of games.
Yeah.
If Keontae and Taylor or Flip and Cody are on the floor at all times, you're going to be bad. And then, sprinkle in Collier, sprinkle in Bryce, those kinds of guys. You're going to just be bad enough at enough positions where sometimes games will go right and those guys will hit shots and Bryce will look awesome, which, by the way, Bryce had some games where he looked really awesome last year. Like, I believed in what Bryce showed. He also had some games where he really struggled, but that's how you do it. You just bet enough times over and over that those guys are not as good yet as the other 67%, 68% of the NBA, so you lose 70% of your games on top of the games you're already going to lose, and you end up with 24 wins.
Yeah. And I think that also, we talked about this before the break, is you don't have to try to lose to the good teams. You're just going to be naturally like out-talented there. Like you're going to lose to the teams that you're supposed to lose to. But you have to also drop the games to the worst teams when you come across them.
You have to be strategic in how you play those games.
Yes, exactly. And that comes down to lineups, right? Like whether it's completely not playing the lower veterans on the roster like Svi Mikhailuk or Patty Mills. Like, of course, Larry Markkinen, bar injury, is going to be playing every single game, 30 minutes. But in the fourth quarter, maybe you're running out Larry Markkinen and 4 sophomore and rookie players.
Yeah.
You cannot have those wins over Toronto. You can't have those wins over Washington. And I'm like, you're going to win some of those games, but you just can't sweep those series.
And here's the nice thing for the Jazz. After the trade deadline, you play Portland, you play Detroit, you played Washington, you play Toronto, you play Toronto twice, I should say. You play Chicago, you play Charlotte. Like, man, that's 7 games. Oh, you played Portland a second time. That's 10 games or 8 games after the trade deadline, if I'm counting right off my fingers. At least 8 games after the trade deadline that I just marked up when the show started. Those were wins early in the year.
Yeah.
Like, you beat Portland 3 times. You swept Toronto. You swept Washington. Okay, you lose those games. You swept Detroit. And a couple of those are on second nights of back-to-backs. Like, you've got a home game against Detroit and a home game against Chicago on the second night of a back-to-back. It's a great excuse after the trade deadline for Larry Markkinen to not see the floor.
Yeah.
Really easy to not play John Collins and Lowry after you play New Orleans the night before and at Minnesota the night before. Yeah, play all your guys against Minnesota. You're not going to beat them.
No.
But play them and then rest them on the second night of a back-to-back and say, hey, that's a lot of work. Well, okay, if you can manufacture losses against Portland, Detroit, Washington, Toronto, Boston, or Chicago again, Toronto again, man, it just gets pretty easy.
Yeah.
That's a lot of games late in the season after the trade deadline against would-be wins that you can have 10-day contract guys on the floor, have young guys on the floor, have Isaiah Collier making all these mistakes to get yourself in that conversation. So really, that's probably it. Don't accidentally win 10 games after the trade deadline against those good teams or those horrible teams.
And I would say specifically, like, there's a few series that the Jazz should look out for. The games against Brooklyn, the games against Washington, Detroit, Charlotte, and Portland. That's 5-team series. And all of them are in the East other than Portland.
Yeah, don't win on the road.
Don't win on the road.
Yeah, don't win on the road. Fine, beat them at home.
Yeah, that's fine.
Throw your season ticket holders some wins, and you're going to have to. And every team wins 20, every team loses 20. I know some teams only won 16 last year, but for the most part, that's about what you're looking at. And then don't win a whole lot of the rest.
Yeah, but no, it comes down to, like, for those teams that are competing for that number 1 overall pick, if you can take a loss and give them a win, that could end up being the difference between the 5th pick and the 2nd pick, right? If you're the Detroit Pistons, you're just going to get the 5th pick regardless. But
yeah, right, doesn't matter. You could have the 13th best odds and somehow get 5th, which is not possible, but they're going to find a way to make it happen. All right, that's going to do it. Great questions today. Really a lot of variety in those questions. So appreciate everybody still listening. I know it's the dead season. I know college football is back next week and everyone's excited about it. But we are still bringing you full-time Jazz coverage every day at KSLSports.com. Find him on Twitter at CHoltSports. Find me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. And we'll be back with you again next week.